In this session, we're going to zoom in and focus on one particular region of the map. We'll make sure that all of the significant geographical landmarks are named, and then we're going to begin working on our first settlement. The settlement I'm choosing is going to be a town of fairly medium size. It's not too big, but it's not so small that we don't have enough to derive a significant plot point for it, because this town that we create is going to be the center point and focus of the first arc in the campaign, which we're going to begin writing in the next session. Geographic is the name of the region that I've chosen for this session. We're going to focus on it because there are 3 big cities that we could flesh out later, numerous towns and other smaller settlements. We have a beautiful mountain range to the north, a huge lake, several rivers, some bays. There's just a lot here that we can work with, and it's a very diverse region. There's a ton of potential in this area, and I'm really excited to get started, so let's just dive in. The first thing you're going to want to do is to go through this region that you've selected and make sure that all of the significant geographic landmarks are properly named. Make sure that you've named your rivers, your lakes, your bays, peninsulas, mountain ranges. Even if there's a large section of forest or an expanse of hills, you might want to consider what the name for that region would be as well. I've already gone through and named all of mine, as I'm going to show down in this corner probably. I guess I have to do it now because that's where I said I would put it. As you're going through and naming these areas, consider taking notes on why you're naming something, what you're naming it. Did a historical event take place here that you want to make sure is noted so that you can reference it in the future? Names may not be significant, but take note of the ones that are so that you can reference them in the future. Especially if you want to have a rich history and backstory for your world, you need to make sure that you're taking notes along the way as you name these things so that later on you're not scratching your head trying to figure out why you named something what you did. Once all of that is done, you need to go through and select a settlement that you want to use as the focus, not only for this session, but for all of the sessions afterward, where we're going to do a deep dive into the settlement, all of its politics, its people, its cultures, and our first arc, which is going to be set in this settlement, or we'll at least use the settlement as a focal point. Of course, if you want, you can just go ahead and change which one you're using in the future, but I would advise making sure you pick one right now that you want to focus on from beginning to end. I'm choosing a settlement that is poised on a river and has an island, and the island is going to serve as part of the settlement, and I have a couple of interesting things I want to do with that. Already this is an area that I can see would be really beautiful and an ideal place to put a settlement. So I'm going to call this settlement Kesset. This is the settlement where the players are going to meet. It's where my first arc is going to be set, and I think that I could make this a very appealing and beautiful location, just given where it is on the map. We have mountain ranges to the north, we have lakes over here to the west, the river flows down from the northeast. This is going to be a beautiful area that will be perfect for the setting of the first arc in my campaign. Note that a population center does not have to be large to be interesting. The first arc of the campaign that I'm currently running took place in a very small settlement with less than 200 people in it. There were 5 to 6 sessions there though, because when you have something that small and compact, you get to flesh out characters more, and any event that may normally be considered small is actually a big deal, because something that wipes out 10 people in the population just killed about 5% of the people here. I would actually advise picking a smaller settlement for the first one that we're going to flesh out here, and then in the future, expanding it and adding a couple more settlements that are a little bit bigger, some big cities or towns nearby. But for this one, I might advise selecting a village. I'm going to pick something a little bit larger than that. Kesset, which is the settlement that I have here, is going to be just a town. It's probably going to have a few thousand residents in it. It's not huge compared to some of the bigger cities nearby, but it is a substantially sized town with a lot of people. Because of the region I picked, I'm already getting some ideas for ways that I can lay this town out. I know that the river that divides the mainland and the island is going to play a big part. I'll probably have a big, beautiful bridge, but we're going to get to all of that later. Make sure that you pick a place that's not too big so that you can focus on the tiny details of it, and find a place that's geographically interesting. Don't just pick a place that's in the middle of a plain because a plain is easy. Pick something that's going to be really interesting and diverse in terms of its geography and the surrounding areas so that you have a lot to work with. With that said, we're going to go ahead and dive into what I call the Settlement Information Form. This is a form that I devised when I was creating my current campaign that allows me to get the details of a particular area so that I can make sure I'm ready in case the players visit something unexpectedly. You can get a copy of the Settlement Information Form by using the link that I have in the description. It'll take you to the blog post, and from there you'll be able to get the resources that you need to follow along with this video. I'd advise that you do that now, download it, open it, and get ready to follow along. We're going to do the broad stroke view of the city first. This is what I did for all of the settlements and cities in my current campaign that I'm running, because I needed to make sure that if my players somehow got to a settlement that I wasn't completely prepared for, I at least had enough details to work from. So things like descriptions, population count, size, what does it look like, what's its primary export and import, all of these things that are smaller details so that I have enough to make the settlement feel alive when the players get to it, and then I can flesh it out more between that session and the next one. In this section, I'm going to break down and summarize what each field on the form means, except for a couple that we're going to dive into later on in this series. As we go through, I'm going to fill out the form myself in relation to the settlement of Kesset that I'm devising here. The first section, and potentially the easiest to fill out, is the settlement details. This is going to be things like population count, the square kilometers that it uses up, and a couple of other smaller details that usually you won't need more than a sentence or so in order to fill out. Later on, we're going to begin writing some paragraphs about the settlement as well to help us get a better understanding of it, but this section here is really just going to be some specifics about it so that you have a solid understanding of the more mechanical aspects of how the settlement functions and what it looks like as the players approach and live inside of it. I would actually advise looking at some real-world locations in order to compare them to your settlement, so you make sure that you get things like the square kilometers and the population count more accurate than you would otherwise by just guessing it. Some towns and settlements are smaller or bigger than you may expect, and their population counts may be more significant or less significant than you might think. So I'd recommend finding a real-world equivalent to what you expect your town or city or village to be. The first section in settlement details is population. This is just where you write the population count. Generally, I prefer to have this be a rough number. My players aren't going to go through and count every single citizen, but I don't just say 6,000 people. I try to be a little more specific than that, even though it's not really relevant, it just helps it feel a little more alive. So while I want 6,000 people to be in Kesset, as that feels like a pretty decent population size for a town that is this significant on the map, I'm also not just going to write 6,000. I'm going to write something like 5,861. That makes it feel a little less mechanical and like there are exactly 6,000 people here. All that says instead is that if they were to do a census, it'd probably be somewhere around 6,000, but there's 5,861 people in the settlement. Again, it's not really going to be super relevant and you don't have to do this, but for me, it just makes it feel a little more alive and realistic. No town is going to stop right on that whole number and say, all right, that's enough, no more people. Next up, we have the demographics. Now, this is going to vary based on your campaign setting and the rule set that you're using, but demographics is specifically how many of each particular race is present in the city. This means, for me, things like half-elves, humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, all of those other races that might be present in the city, what's the rough percentage of them as it pertains to the population? This settlement is going to be mostly humans. They're going to have more than a 50% majority over the other races combined. There will still be a lot of variety in terms of the other races. So here I'm going to break it down in terms of percentages. I'm thinking 58% human, 18% half-elves, 17% halflings, 5% gnomes, and 2% other. Seems like a pretty decent enough mix. I might go back through and fix that up a little, but that seems pretty straightforward to me and helps establish that this town is mostly humans, but there are other races present. It's not like they are barring them from entry. There will also be points in the future where you might put a settlement that has mostly dwarves in it because it's in a region that is heavily populated by dwarves, and that's pretty normal for a fantasy setting. If you have a sci-fi setting that has some aliens or is just humans, but they are humans of maybe different sex or something like that, you can go ahead and specify that here. What percentage of them are this sect of humans and which percent of them are this sect of humans? Maybe you do it based on political leanings or something like that. Find some way to diversify the population, or even say this population is 100% this kind of person, to make it feel almost claustrophobic and suffocating with the kind of viewpoints that you might encounter within that setting. There are all sorts of ways to do this, and having a percentage so you know who has the majority and what the minority is like and what the minority might experience on a day-to-day basis will help it feel a lot more realistic. The next section is the appearance. This isn't where you're going to write an entire paragraph about what it looks like while you're in the town. This is more just one line that kind of describes a general idea. If you had to summarize your town and what it looks like with a single line, what would it read? For this one, I'm going to say primarily small buildings. There's some water features. The bridge is a big central landmark, and there is farmland that kind of covers some region of it that has lots of irrigation systems, windmills, that sort of thing. I will probably phrase it better than I just did. That's just a vague summary of what you want to go for here. Next, we have the economy. Again, just like with the appearance, you don't want to write an entire paragraph here. You want to summarize it with roughly a single line. For Kesset, the economy is actually fairly strong. There's a harbor here to allow for plenty of trading. There's a bridge and a mainland that has lots of farming. There's a lot of room for economic growth and prosperity here. So I'm going to say that the economy is average, but it is growing steadily. Next is square kilometers. I found this to actually be really important because when you're looking at the scale of a town or city, you as the dungeon master or game mother, I think is the one in Alien, whatever your role is, when you're creating this campaign in this world, you want to make sure you have a pretty decent grasp on scale. You don't want to sit here and say it's 100 miles by 100 miles. Like, that's massive. That's impossibly huge. For this, I'm going to say it's 6 square kilometers. That's a pretty big town, but it's also not factoring in things like the expansive farmland far in the distance. So 6 square kilometers, that's going to give me plenty of playroom for adding interesting buildings, several districts, having the bridge divide the island and the mainland, as well as having just the farmland off to the side. If I need to expand it, I can just bump the number up to 7 or 8, but this is roughly the size that I want it to be. Again, I would advise looking at a real world equivalent to the town or city that you're wanting to develop, so you can get an idea of how much space it should take up. This isn't going to be precise because the way that we have roads laid out today is not really going to be equal to the way roads may be laid out in your city. For example, if it's a futuristic or science fiction style city, the roads may be a lot larger than they are today, whereas in medieval times they were very small and narrow, and today they're pretty wide to allow for cars. It's not going to be exact, but it's going to give you a pretty good idea of how scale works when it comes to city layouts and development. Next is the demonym. This is pretty simple. It's just what people are called in your region. If they are from Kesset, what are they called? If they're from your town, what are they called? For Kesset, I'm just going to go pretty simple and call them Kessens. Seems straightforward, makes sense. This isn't something you need to spend a ton of time on unless it's really important to your campaign. You want to make sure that it's something compelling, but honestly, most of it is just going to end with like Ishian or N or something like that. Just slightly change the name of the town. So people from Kesset are Kessen. Simple enough. The next field that I have in the details is called the banner field. You may not need this for yours, but banner specifically means what are the main colors and the symbol or emblems in relation to this town, city, village, what have you. In my current campaign, I added banner because we used banners to distinguish multiple settlements from each other. So each of them has a unique color scheme and symbol that represents them. For this campaign, banners were relevant, and they will probably be relevant in the future for some of the cities that I have here, but Kesset isn't very big compared to some of the large cities that are around it. So it probably doesn't need colors, and I'm just going to leave the banner blank or say that it has no banner. Kesset doesn't have a need for one. It doesn't need its own colors or symbol because it's not going out and seeking representation. So Kesset, no banner. Your city or settlement might have a banner. If it does, name what the colors are, name what the flag looks like, things like that. After you're done with the settlement details and all of those fields, it's time to move on to the next one, which is the government. This is where you describe how the government works. You aren't going to talk specifically about each individual who makes up the government. That's something that we would add to the notable people section later on, and that's not going to take place until several videos from now. Right now, we just want to focus on describing how the government works, what kind of government it is, and what the state of it is. For example, this might be where you write about how the government has severely overreached and there is now mass incarceration in your settlement and people are being imprisoned for just the most minor things so they can start working for the government's giant slave operation. Something like that. Like, it doesn't have to be necessarily, this is how the government is supposed to work. This government is a republic. No, this is everything about the government that you, the DM, are going to need to know. You don't need to know the specifics of who did it or anything like that. Just tell me what the players are going to experience and what they should expect when they come here. A good way of summarizing this would be describe how the government is intended to work, and then tell me how the government actually works. Kesset will be a plutocracy. Plutocracy. Why can I not pronounce any words correctly? Kesset will be a plutocracy, meaning that it is merchant-run and owned. The merchants of Kesset own and operate pretty much everything in this settlement. This started as a trading post, which in the previous video I advised that you lay out where some trading posts would be, and Kesset is a natural trading post that would have popped up between two cities. It's in an ideal location for one. So it began as a trading post that was probably run by some merchants who wanted to make sure they always had a place to stay and conduct their business. Now this trading post has grown into this large town that has a growing population and a flourishing economy. However, no government was ever truly defined for Kesset, and now it has gotten especially large. So the traders who founded it, and probably some of their descendants, now just operate everything in Kesset. They take fees from people who use the trading post that they and their fathers or mothers set up. There's no true established government here. It is pretty much run and operated by these merchants. There isn't necessarily a tax here. Instead, what happens is they just take fees from everybody, which is what a tax is ultimately. They just avoid calling it that. Instead, they take fees and collect them from people who use the trading post, use the docks and harbors, the piers, even people who use the farmland. All of these people have to pay fees to the merchants that own and operate all of Kesset. You can be as detailed as you like here. I prefer to keep my description of the government short and poignant so I have just enough information to work off of, but can be a bit flexible as the campaign proceeds and I see how my players interact with it. For this, I might write 1 or maybe 2 paragraphs about how the government is supposed to work and expected to work, or even how it says it works, and then how it actually works, what it looks like on the back end behind closed doors. Now we get to the layout of the town. This is also pretty straightforward. You may actually consider creating a map for this. I usually create maps for my settlements and cities because it helps give my players an understanding of size, location, layout, that sort of thing. I may make a map later on, but for now I'm just going to describe what the layout looks like. I already have a picture in mind of what Kesset is going to look like. We have this big island that is divided from the mainland by a river, and I intend for that to almost be a symbol of separation between the lower class citizens of the mainland and the upper class citizens, especially the members of the plutocracy over on the island. Anyone who is wealthy can afford to live on the island. So the stone bridge acts almost as a wall that separates the people of the mainland from the wealthy people on the island. This alone already gives me a pretty strong idea of how I would lay out the rest of the city. The harbor, docks, farms, and the rundown side of the city in general would be over on the mainland, while the island is a symbol of wealth and prosperity and has fancy buildings, nice statues and fountains, education. All of that is available to the people who happen to live on the island. There will be an almost comical contrast between the dirty and grimy mainland and the fine, fancy, beautiful, illustrious island where there are courtyards and gardens and fountains and all of these other things that make it clear this is where the rich people live, and over here is where we put all of the lower class citizens of Kesset. After the layout, we have geography. Geography should be pretty straightforward because we already created the map, we've zoomed in on this region, we've named some of the geographical landmarks around it. We're well equipped already to get this geography taken care of. We can just look at our map and know what these people have access to, what they can see when they start leaving the town, or what you might see as you approach the town. For example, if you approach from the south by boat and you crest up on Kesset, you'll see the harbor, and then way off in the distance you'll see the beautiful mountain ranges to the north. In spite of the disparity between the mainland and the island, Kesset is really beautiful. You have the sun setting over the lake to the west every night, you have the beautiful mountain ranges to the north, the sun rises over the river to the northeast, and it is just gorgeous. I don't mean to fantasize about my own town, but come on, this is going to be a beautiful place, especially standing on the bridge and watching the sunset and the sun rise on either side of it. This is a really nice area, and I want to make sure that when I describe the geography, I'm making that well known. I'm also going to make a note that man-made creeks have slightly modified the geography as they seek to funnel water from the river to the farmland of the city. You don't have to go too in-depth with this. You can be as detailed or vague as you like. Just make sure you have a solid understanding of where your settlement is in relation to other important things on the map. We have mountains near us, there's forests, there's hills. This is all information the players might need and that you should make sure they are aware of and have at their disposal. You may even consider finding some photos that might represent certain aspects of your town. For example, I might show my players distant mountains and an expansive wheat field to show them just what it really looks like when you're standing out and you're looking over this gorgeous field of golden wheat shimmering from all of the water and irrigation that runs through it, and then you just see mountains up in the distance. This is going to be a gorgeous view even if you have a slightly grimy town right behind you. So find photos, even if they're just to inspire you instead of your players. This is going to help you get a good idea of what it looks like to be in your settlement. Next we have resources. Earlier, we broke down the economy with just a single line talking about how the economy is doing. Resources is going to be more specific and detailed than that. This is where you're going to write about the resources it has at its disposal and what it requires from other settlements to continue moving forward. There are a few ways that you can go about doing this. You can create a list, you can make a table, you can describe it. For me, I like writing a couple of paragraphs about it, but I might also make a table in some cases if I just need to break it down very simply and straightforward and just want it done. For Kesset, I'm just going to write a couple of paragraphs about how it produces food to sustain itself and how it uses things like the trading harbor in order to produce income for itself that it uses to import multiple other goods from nearby settlements. Producing and selling food is going to help Kesset considerably. Most of Kesset's income is going to come from people who trade and dock at its port. Kesset does have much of what it needs to survive. It can even get its own granite and wood from the hills and forests up to the north and northeast, but it does import quite a bit, especially for the luxury items that the people on the island want. Things like fine jewels, clothing, art, all of these are going to be imported in order for the people on the island to purchase and decorate their homes and really their entire island with. They'll get statues brought to them. All of this is going to be imported. There are also going to be many essential things they have to import, like coal and linen and rope, medicinal plants. All of these are things they aren't producing here in Kesset, and so they have to import it in order to survive. I'm making notes of that here, going to write a couple of paragraphs, and then I'll move on to the next section. Alright, we're almost done. I know this is a long one, but we only have a little bit more to go. This next section is going to be points of interest. Points of interest should actually be fairly straightforward, as we're not going to do a deep dive into it until a later episode. Here, I just want to actually list all of the points of interest rather than go into detail about the people who might inhabit it and be present in it, what it represents and sells, what it looks like. All of these descriptions, they're all things that I'm going to get into later on in this series. In the settlement information form, there's a section called points of interest, and you're going to find a table in there. Go ahead and copy and paste that table a few times in the points of interest section in order to make sure that you have enough of these tables to fill out, as they're each going to represent a shop or landmark within your settlement. For example, I'm going to be making sure that the bridge is a point of interest, the harbor is one, any taverns, schools, that sort of thing. It's all going to be a point of interest within Kesset. For this, I just want to fill out the type and the summary. I might fill out the name for a couple of them if I already have a good name for this point of interest in mind, but right now I just want to make sure that I know what all is present so that I can fill it out later and add those details in a later session. Each settlement needs a few core features. It's not going to have every single one of these in each case, but these are the cores that you want to try to tackle with each of your settlements. These are going to be food, healing, happiness, religion, sanitation, knowledge, and defense. There are definitely more than what I've just listed here, but these are the core ones that I generally focus on with each settlement. And each of these has a pretty broad reach. Defense, for example, isn't just guardhouses. You may have the blacksmith be part of the defense because the blacksmith is producing the weapons and armor that the guards use. Not every settlement is going to meet every single one of these needs. For example, they won't all have religion, but most of them are probably going to at least have a shrine of some kind, unless it's a settlement that has completely outright banned religion. So bear that in mind and try to think of at least one point of interest for each of the items that I listed. I'm going to add the bridge, the farming district, the harbor. I'm even going to list a school that's only present on the island for the wealthy people to get an education at, while everybody else just works the farm on the mainland. I'll even have an apothecary, a crude sewer system, a couple of other things just to make sure that I have plenty that I can flesh out when we get to that later video. Even though this settlement is only really nice on the island and is pretty nasty on the mainland, it's still going to have a lot of features that some smaller settlements and villages wouldn't have. With this list ready to go and a type and summary at least for each of these areas, I'm already getting excited to start fleshing them out, but I'm going to hold off until we get to that section of this series. Holy crap, that was a lot more than I thought we were going to get to in this video. Not only did we go through and name our rivers and bays, peninsulas, we also named our settlement and we added a whole bunch of details to it to help bring it to life. We also have multiple fields that we still need to fill out in the future, so I hope you're getting excited to do that in a later session. We're going to put that off for a couple of weeks though, because the next video that we have coming up is actually going to start writing our first arc. This is going to help us flesh out our settlement a little bit more as we add details to the settlement that we need to make the first arc work. I hope you're also beginning to think about a conflict that you might have for your first arc just based on the information you've provided regarding this first settlement. For me, I already have an idea in my brain that's kind of rolling around that I'm excited to get to, involving a conflict between the people on the island and the people of the mainland. This is also just one of the many settlements on your map that you can work on. Between now and the next video, if you want to, you can start adding these same details to some of the other settlements in the area. That'll give you a stronger idea of how the economy is working not only for this settlement, but for the other ones. And if your settlement relies on clothing, maybe this other settlement you have is what produces that clothing. I'm just sticking to Kesset for now, but we're definitely going to need to add those details to the other settlements in the surrounding area in the near future. I hope you got something out of this video and enjoyed it. If you did like it and you got something out of it, please consider supporting me. Any amount of support is greatly appreciated, whether it's a like or a subscription or a comment about your settlement and what you're excited to see come up next. I would really appreciate it, and it would help me out a great deal. As I noted near the beginning of the video, if you want the settlement information form, you can get it from the link to the blog version of this post down below in the description. Stay tuned for the next video where we're going to dive into our first arc. We're going to have 2 sessions back to back where we talk about the first arc and get it ready for our players. Until then, bye. What was that?